I want to record this accurately, which means I need to begin where the records already begin, with my assumption that the subject was going to die. Not an opinion, an assumption held so completely that I had not considered the alternative. When the transfer notice came through from the Cathara Port Authority intake unit on the morning of the 14th day of the 8th rotation, the file attached to it was marked Survivorship Incident, Anomalous, and I remember reading that designation without any particular interest, because survivorship anomalies in transspecies intake processing tend to mean one of three things: a miscounted body, a paperwork delay, or an organic whose recovery has been overestimated by a field unit without proper xenobiological training. We see perhaps 4 or 5 per rotation, most resolve within a day. The anomaly designation is, in practice, a placeholder, a flag that says someone's numbers don't match the expectation, pending a qualified review. Qualified review, in the overwhelming majority of cases, produces a revised expectation and a closed file. I assigned this one to my junior colleague, Dr. Dross Kale, and went back to my own work. Dross came to find me 40 minutes later. He did not knock, which he normally does. He simply walked into my workspace with his data pad held out in front of him the way you hold something that has bitten you at arm's length, pointed away from yourself. He set it on my workbench without speaking. I looked at the screen. Then I looked at Dross. Then I looked at the screen again. "Is the scanner calibrated?" I said. "3 times, Dross said. "I ran the full recalibration sequence twice before I came to find you. The 3rd time I ran it while I was standing in front of the unit watching it run. And this is what it returns. That is what it returns." I picked up the data pad. I looked at the scan for longer than I should have needed to, because I was waiting for it to resolve into something I recognized. It did not resolve. Let me provide the relevant context before I describe what I saw on that screen, because without it the readings are simply numbers, and numbers are easy to dismiss. The subject had been aboard a Catharan-registered freighter, the Sasuvan Passage, which had been involved in a docking arm collision at the Relsasa IV Transit Hub 11 days prior. The collision was significant. The Transit Authority's incident report described a structural failure in the hub's berthing array. One of the secondary docking arms, rated to accept vessels up to 14,000 cubic spans, had sheared at its lower joint under load redistribution stress and swung into the Sasuvan Passage's starboard midsection at a velocity sufficient to partially breach the hull. The breach had been sealed by emergency bulkhead before full atmospheric loss, but not before a section of the crew quarters was exposed to the hull impact and to the near decompression event that followed. 3 crew members had been in that section. 2 were Verlin. Both were dead before the emergency response units reached them, one from the blunt force event itself, one from atmospheric trauma in the minute and a half before the bulkhead sealed. The Verlin physiology is well documented, and its susceptibility to rapid pressure change is a known variable in transit safety assessments. Their deaths were not anomalous. They were, in fact, exactly what the models predict. The 3rd crew member was a human. His name was recorded in the Transit Authority file as Corvin Male. His species designation, Terran. His role on the Sasuvan Passage, General Systems Engineer, 3rd-tier clearance. He was 31 years old by his own planet's calendar, which translates to approximately 24 standard cycles. He was described in the initial incident triage as male, medium build, no pre-existing medical conditions on record. He had been approximately 2 spans from the primary impact point when the docking arm made contact with the hull. The triage unit that reached him described what they found. I'm including their notes here verbatim because they matter to everything that follows. The notes read, "Subject male found unresponsive at scene. Blunt force trauma to the right side of the thoracic cavity. Probable rib fractures multiple, minimum 4. Left side shoulder structure compromised, joint dislocation, possible fracture of the clavicular process. Deep soft tissue laceration, left posterior flank approximately 8 to 12 spans in length, depth unclear in field conditions. Minor lacerations, face and right forearm not life-threatening. Subject unresponsive. Vitals, present but critically degraded. Transfer recommended. Critically degraded. That was the phrase. The triage unit transferred him to the Relsasa IV medical hold, where the station physician, a Varathi medic named Asan Dale, not a xenobiologist, a general practice station physician, examined him and noted that the thoracic trauma was likely to be fatal without surgical intervention, that the subject appeared to be in a state of vascular shock, and that surgical intervention was inadvisable given the absence of a qualified human medicine specialist aboard. Asan Dale's note in the file reads, monitoring initiated. Anticipate mortality within 6 to 18 hours. Xenobiological consult requested. Transfer to Kethara Institute prioritized if subject stabilizes. The subject did not stabilize in the way Asan Dale meant. The subject stabilized in a different way entirely, which is why Asan Dale's request for a xenobiological consult was followed, 11 days later, by a transfer note reading survivorship incident anomalous, and why Dross Kale was standing in my workroom holding a data pad at arm's length. The scan Dross showed me was a full-spectrum structural imaging of the subject's thoracic cage. I need to be precise about what full-spectrum structural imaging shows, for anyone reading this account who is not a xenobiologist. It is not a surface examination. It maps internal structure, bone density, fracture lines, stress points, connective tissue integrity, fluid accumulation, vascular architecture, at a resolution that allows us to date with reasonable precision the age of any given injury. Bone fractures show their age in the healing response. Recent fractures show clean break lines, periosteal disruption, the early mineralization response if any has begun. Older fractures show progressive stages of remodeling. Between those two poles is a gradient we know extremely well. We have comparative data across several hundred species. The gradient does not vary enormously from one oxygen-breathing biped to the next. The timelines differ somewhat in absolute terms, but the shape of the response is consistent. What the scan showed on Corvin Male's thoracic structure did not fit the gradient. He had fractured 4 ribs. This was not in question. The break lines were visible, and they were unmistakably recent in origin. They were clean, high-energy breaks consistent with the blunt force mechanism described in the triage report. But the healing response was wrong. The periosteal bridging that we would expect to see beginning at roughly 7 to 10 days post-fracture in most comparably sized oxygen-breathing species was not in an early phase. It was advanced. It was substantially, measurably advanced beyond what the timeline of 11 days from the incident should have produced. In Verlin physiology, which is our closest well-documented comparison in this body mass range, 4 fractured ribs at 11 days post-incident would show clean break lines with initial periosteal callus formation, granulation tissue present, early but incomplete bridging. Fragile, not weight-bearing. Painful by all accounts to the point of incapacitation. In the human subject's scan, the bridging was continuous. Not complete. I want to be careful here because I have reviewed this account several times for precision, and I do not want to overstate what the scan showed. The bridging was not what we would call healed, but it was what we would call, in Verlin physiology, 4 to 6 weeks post-fracture, not 11 days. Not even close to 11 days. I looked at the scan for a long time. Then I said, run the isotope decay sequencing on the break sites. I want an independent age estimate from the mineral deposition. Dross said, I already ran it. And it returns consistent with 8 to 11 days, give or take. The breaks are recent. The scan isn't wrong about the age of the injury. Then the healing response is wrong. No, Dross said, with a patience that told me he had already worked through this exact sequence of thoughts. The healing response is real. The scanner is not malfunctioning. The calibration is not off. The age of the injury is confirmed by independent method. The healing response is simply faster than it should be. I set the data pad down. How much faster? I said. Dross thought for a moment. If a Verlin healed at this rate, he said, we would describe the Verlin as having a significant pathological condition requiring investigation. I looked at the pad. Schedule the examination, I said. Corvin Mail was brought to my examination room on the morning of the 16th day of the 8th rotation, 2 days after the transfer note arrived. He had been ambulatory for the preceding 4 days, which I also noted in my file with something approaching disbelief, given what the scans showed and what the original triage report had described. He was not what I expected. I do not know exactly what I had expected. I had reviewed the file. I had seen the injury documentation. I had worked with human subjects before on intake physicals, though never with one who had been through something like this. I suppose I expected someone who looked compromised, someone who moved with the careful minimalism of a body in protective withdrawal from pain. He was sitting in the examination chair when I came in, his legs stretched out in front of him, his arms resting on the chair's sides in the relaxed posture of someone waiting for a transit connection. He was tall, taller than the intake documentation had made him sound, or perhaps it was the proportion of him, the shoulders, the particular way humans distribute their mass. He looked at me when I came in with that flat, attentive expression I have come to associate with human subjects who are trying to determine whether the situation they are in requires them to be concerned or not. Dr. Saul, he said. Yes, I said. Dross said you wanted to run some additional scans. I do, I said. I settled at my workstation and called up his file. I want to start by asking you some questions if you're willing. He shrugged with one shoulder, his right shoulder, I noted, not his left, which was consistent with the left clavicular injury. Sure, he said. How are you feeling? I said. He considered this question with more seriousness than most subjects do. Stiff, he said after a moment. Ribs are still tight, left shoulder's still sore. The cut on my back is itching, which I've been told means it's healing, so I'm choosing to take that as a positive. Is the itching severe? He made a face, a mild one. It's annoying, it's not severe. Are you experiencing difficulty breathing? No, not anymore. First few days were rough. Felt like someone was sitting on my chest every time I tried to take a full breath. He paused. That stopped around day 4 or 5. Day 4 or 5. I made a note of that without allowing my expression to change. And the shoulder, I said. Painful when I rotate past about here, he demonstrated, lifting his left arm and rotating it gently to roughly a 60-degree angle from his body. He winced, a real wince, unguarded. Past that. Below that it's fine. You're able to lift it to 60 degrees, I said. He frowned slightly at my tone. Is that not normal? It is not what I would have predicted, I said carefully. For your specific injury at 11 days, I would have predicted limited range of motion, perhaps 20 degrees, with significant pain below that threshold. He looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. Huh, he said. That was all he said, just huh. The physical examination took 2 hours. I ran 3 separate scan sequences on his thoracic and left shoulder structures, each using a different imaging modality, each returning the same result. I brought Dross in for the second scan because I wanted a witness to the readings, and because Dross has an excellent eye for calibration error. If the equipment was producing a systematic artifact, Dross would catch it. He stood at the secondary display for 40 minutes and did not catch anything, because there was nothing to catch. The ribs were bridging at the rate of something between 4 and 6 weeks post-fracture, at 11 days. The left clavicular process, which had shown a fracture line in the triage imaging, had, in the current scans, a fracture line that was substantially reduced. Not gone, visible if you looked for it in the highest resolution mode. But the periosteal response at that site was advanced to a degree that the fracture line was, functionally, beginning to disappear into the surrounding remodeled tissue. The soft tissue laceration on his left posterior flank, the wound that the triage unit had estimated at 8 to 12 spans in length and undetermined depth, was closed. I should clarify, the wound was closed, not bandaged, not held closed by secondary intervention. The wound had closed. Scar tissue was present, new and thin and not yet fully matured but continuous. The wound beneath it, when I ran the subsurface imaging, showed complete epidermal and dermal closure, with underlying tissue repair in progress, the new collagen architecture laid down in an irregular but functional pattern. 11 days. A wound of that size in Verlin physiology would be expected to be closed with appropriate wound care, suturing where indicated and clean conditions, in 20 to 30 days. In less favorable conditions, longer. In cases of physical stress on the wound margins, which a docking arm impact, followed by near decompression, followed by several days of whatever the subject had experienced before transfer, would certainly constitute, the closure timeline would extend further. The wound was closed at 11 days. I cataloged every finding. I made Dross review every finding. I made him sign the review attestation. He signed it with the particular look of someone who has just been asked to formally confirm something they would prefer to be wrong about. Then I went back to the examination room, where Corvin Mayle had been waiting with the equanimity of a man who had been waiting in a great many examination rooms in his life, and had made peace with the experience. "Mr. Mayle," I said, "I have some questions about your recovery." "Sure," he said. "Have you received any treatment, any external treatment, for your injuries since the initial incident? Anything beyond the monitoring that the Rel Sasa station provided?" He thought about this. "They cleaned the cut on my back," he said. "Applied some kind of sealant. I don't know what species it was formulated for, didn't seem to do much, honestly. They offered something for the pain on the second day. I took it. Made me feel foggy, so I stopped after the third day." "You stopped the pain medication?" "It wasn't doing enough for the ribs to justify what it was doing to my head. I figured I'd rather be clear and uncomfortable than foggy, and slightly less uncomfortable." I noted this. "And you received no surgical intervention, no bone setting, no assisted repair of any kind?" He shook his head. "Asan told me the ribs would either heal or they wouldn't, and that the safest option was not to start cutting into someone whose physiology you didn't fully know. I agreed with that." He paused. "I assume you're asking because something in the scans is weird." "Yes," I said. He waited. He did not seem alarmed by this. He seemed, if anything, mildly curious. "The rate at which your injuries are healing," I said, "is not consistent with what I would expect given the timeline and the severity of the initial trauma." He tilted his head slightly, meaning faster or slower. "Faster," I said, "significantly." He made the same small expression he had made when I mentioned the 60-degree range of motion. "Huh," he said again. Then, "Is that a problem?" I considered how to answer that question. "Not for you," I said. He accepted this with a nod and said nothing further. He asked me, before he left, how long the examination process was likely to take. I told him we would need approximately 2 more weeks of monitoring before we could complete the clearance assessment. He thanked me, told me he had a cargo run scheduled that he was already behind on, and asked if there was anything he should avoid doing in the meantime that might affect the readings. I told him light activity was fine. He nodded, stood up from the examination chair smoothly, without the bracing against pain motion I would have expected, and walked out. Dross was watching through the monitoring glass. After the subject had gone, Dross came in. He stood in the doorway. He said, "Light activity is fine." I did not want to alarm him, I said. "He didn't seem particularly alarmable," Dross said. That was true. The monitoring period was 14 days. I want to give a sequential account of what those 14 days showed, because the sequence matters. It was not a single dramatic finding. It was a series of readings, each one individually explicable if you were willing to work for an explanation, each one becoming harder to explain away as the series continued, and the explanations accumulated into something too heavy to carry. Day 1 of monitoring, thoracic structural scan. Bridging advanced from previous scan by a small but measurable margin. I noted this and told Dross we would wait for a larger dataset before drawing conclusions. Day 3 of monitoring, follow-up scan all structures, thoracic bridging continuing to advance. Left clavicular fracture line, already reduced at examination day, reduced further. The word I used in my notes was substantially. I used it because it was accurate and because I did not yet want to use the word I was actually thinking, which was remarkably. I saved my remarkablies. Dross reviewed the scans without comment and made his own notes. I want to say something about what it is like to watch a case file develop in this way. In routine xenobiological intake work, the monitoring period is largely administrative. You watch the numbers change. You confirm that what was expected is happening. You sign off, you close the file, you move to the next one. The monitoring period exists because it has to exist, but in the vast majority of cases it is a formality, a confirmation of the prediction, not a revision of it. This monitoring period was not that. It was the specific discomfort of watching your prediction unmake itself, systematically, one data point at a time. Each scan returned a reading that was explicable on its own, healing proceeds, structures advance, but which advanced farther than it should have advanced, by increments small enough that each one could be individually rationalized, and large enough that the rationalizations were beginning to require more work than they were worth. Dross and I did not speak about this directly, not at day 3. We did not need to. We both knew what we were looking at. We were each waiting for the other data points to make denial untenable, so that when we did speak about it directly, neither of us would have to feel like we were being premature. Day 5. I had the lab run a full blood panel. The results were not immediately useful to the bone repair question, but they are relevant to the overall picture I am constructing here, so I include them. Every measurable metabolic indicator for tissue repair and remodeling, the molecular signaling components, the cell proliferation markers, the enzymatic activity associated with collagen synthesis and matrix remodeling, was elevated. Not pathologically elevated, not in the way we would associate with an inflammatory crisis. Elevated in the way you would expect to see in an organism actively, vigorously, comprehensively engaged in repair work. All of it, simultaneously, across multiple tissue systems at once. Dross looked at the panel results and said, "It's doing everything at once." "Yes," I said. "Not prioritizing," he said, "everything." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "How does it have the resources for that?" he said. I did not have an answer. Day 7. The subject came in for his mid-monitoring examination. He moved more freely than he had at the first examination. The left shoulder, at 60 degrees of rotation on the first visit, with a wince at that threshold, was now at approximately 90 degrees before discomfort. He demonstrated this when I asked, rotating the arm in a slow, deliberate arc, pausing when he felt the limit. "Better than last week," he said. "Yes," I said. "Good," he said, with a satisfaction that had nothing triumphant in it. Just the simple satisfaction of a thing being better than it was. I ran the scan. The left clavicular fracture line was, and I used the clinical term deliberately, resolving. What had been a fracture line at 11 days, reduced at the first monitoring scan, was now resolving, becoming, under the imaging, more ghost than line. I ran the scan again in the highest resolution mode and sat looking at the output for a very long time. Dross was in the room. I did not need to say anything to him. He was looking at the same output. "That's 32 days post-injury," Dross said quietly. Meaning, this was what we would expect to see in a Verlin at 32 days post-injury, not at 18 days. "Yes," I said. "Is there any possibility," Dross said, with the careful tone of a scientist who has already eliminated the possibility he is about to raise but needs to say it out loud anyway, "that the initial triage imaging was wrong, that the fractures were less severe than reported?" "I reviewed the triage imaging this morning," I said. "The fractures were exactly as severe as reported. The break energy, you can calculate it from the fracture morphology, is consistent with the impact mechanism described. There is no version of these injuries that was less severe." Dross nodded slowly. "Then the timeline is correct," he said, "and the recovery is correct." "Yes." He sat with that for a moment. "I'm going to need to file an anomaly notice," he said. "I know," I said. "Let me finish the monitoring period first. I want a complete data set." Day 10. I asked the subject about his dietary habits during recovery. He was, by this point, comfortable enough with the examination routine to find the question slightly amusing. He told me he had been eating, and here I asked him to be specific, and he was, with the pragmatic specificity of someone who has thought about this because food on a cargo freighter is a logistical variable, and he manages logistical variables as a profession. He had been eating more than usual, he said. Noticeably more. He'd noticed it starting around day 3. His appetite had roughly doubled by his estimate. He'd mentioned it to Asan at the station, who had noted it and attributed it to metabolic stress response post-trauma. He said it was the body's way of fueling the healing process, the subject said. He seemed satisfied with that explanation. "Were you?" I said. He thought about it. "I figured he knew more about it than I did," he said. "Is it relevant?" "It may be," I said. "The energy expenditure required to produce the healing response we are observing would be substantial. Knowing that your caloric intake increased significantly during that period is relevant to the model." He was quiet for a moment. "The model," he said. "Yes." "What model are you building?" I looked at him. He was not asking with anxiety. He was asking with genuine curiosity, the way an engineer asks about a system he is not familiar with and wants to understand. "I am trying," I said, "to accurately characterize what your body is doing." "And it is doing it faster than I expected," I said, "and more completely." He nodded slowly. "Then is that bad?" "Not for you," I said again. He looked at me with an expression that was not quite a smile, more a mild recognition, as if he had just confirmed something he'd half suspected. He didn't push further. He thanked me for my time, in the way he always thanked me, without performance, without anxiety, and went back to whatever he did with his days during the monitoring period, which I later learned from the intake unit's activity log included reading, maintaining some personal equipment he'd transferred from the freighter, and eating what the cafeteria staff described as an alarming quantity of food for someone his size. I want to dwell on the dietary finding for a moment, because I think it is underappreciated in the context of the overall case. There is a tendency in xenobiological research to focus on the dramatic structural findings, the bone density increase, the accelerated bridging, the closed wound, because these are the findings that are most legible in the imaging record and most easily expressed in comparative terms. The dietary finding is softer data. It is self-reported, subject to the usual limitations of retrospective personal accounting, and it does not have a clean baseline because, we do not have documentation of the subject's normal intake in non-recovery conditions. But it is important. The body does not produce something from nothing. Every gram of new bone mineral, every meter of new collagen architecture, every layer of new epithelial closure has to come from somewhere. The raw material has to be sourced, processed, and delivered to the site of repair. In a recovery process running at the rate I was observing in subject male, the demand on those supply chains would be enormous, far beyond what a standard post-trauma metabolic response would support. The doubling of caloric intake that he reported, starting on day 3, is not a curious side note. It is the fuel accounting for the work I was seeing in the scans. What I found myself thinking about, on day 10, was a specific calculation I had not performed in any formal way but which kept running in the back of my mind throughout the monitoring period. What the net effect of this system looks like over time, across a lifetime. A Terran who sustains a significant injury in, say, their late second decade of life recovers on this timeline within a few weeks. They return to full activity. The repaired sites are, per my findings, marginally stronger than the originals. Some months or years later, they sustain another injury, different site, or the same, it doesn't matter for the calculation, and recover again on the same timeline, again emerging with a body that has been, in the specific engineering sense, stress-tested and reinforced at those sites. This process repeats across decades. What you end up with at the end of several decades of this cycle is an organism that has been continuously load-tested, repaired, and subtly strengthened at each repair site, across multiple injury events throughout an active working life. I noted this calculation in my personal log. I did not include it in the formal report because it was speculative. I had one subject and his own limited self-report history, and extrapolating a lifetime trajectory from that is not sound science. I was conservative in the report. I remain conservative about it now. But I think about that calculation. Day 11. The blood panel from day 5 returned its full enzymatic analysis, which takes additional processing time and which I had been waiting for. The collagen synthesis markers, which I had noted as elevated on day 5, had continued to rise. By day 11, they were at a level I would associate, in most documented species, with a body in the acute early phase of a major wound closure event. Not a body 3.5 weeks post-incident, with a wound that had already been visibly closed since approximately day 14. I ran the analysis again, same result. Dross looked at the numbers and said, "It's still going." "Yes," I said. "The wound is closed." "Yes." "And it's still running the process," I said. "Yes." We sat with that for a moment. "It doesn't know it's done," Dross said. "That may not be the right frame," I said. "It may be that it is not done. It may be that the external closure is the visible part of a longer internal process, consolidation, maturation, full remodeling of the deeper tissue layers. Processes that in other species we might not think to monitor because the external closure is the endpoint we care about. In this organism, the external closure may not be the endpoint." Dross was quiet. "Meaning there's more to come," he said. "Meaning," I said carefully, "that I don't know where the endpoint is." He thought about that for a long moment. Then he said, "Vthun, do we have data on what Terran tissue looks like when it is fully at baseline, not post-injury, just normal, uninjured tissue at rest?" I told him I had some reference samples from the xenobiological literature. Standard intake imaging from routine physicals. He asked me to pull them and run a comparison against the current scan data. I did. The comparison took most of the afternoon. I will summarize what we found. The subject's tissue at day 11 of monitoring, at 22 days post-incident, at a state that any clinical observer would describe as recovered, showed an internal activity signature that, when placed against the baseline reference literature for pteron physiology, was not dramatically different from normal resting values. Not dramatically different. Meaning, this level of enzymatic activity, these collagen synthesis markers, this continuous low-level remodeling signal, this was, apparently, not far from what a healthy, uninjured pteron looks like on the inside. They run warm. That was what Dross said when I showed him the comparison. He said very quietly, they run warm. I told him that was an imprecise characterization. He agreed it was imprecise. He also said he was going to keep thinking of it that way regardless. I understood. Day 12, thoracic scan. The 4 fractured ribs were, in the imaging, no longer fractured. I want to say that plainly without qualification, because there is no way to say it that makes it easier to absorb. At 18 days post-incident, because by this point we were 18 days from the docking arm collision, 4 rib fractures that had been high-energy breaks with clear fracture morphology on triage imaging were in the full-spectrum structural scan resolved. The bridging was complete. The remodeling was advanced beyond what I would describe as early stage. The fracture lines were not visible in standard imaging. I found residual mineral density variation, a subtle asymmetry in the new bone compared to the surrounding native tissue, in the highest resolution subsurface mode, and only then, and only because I knew exactly where to look. Dross ran his own scan. He spent 16 minutes at the imaging station. He came to my workbench and set his data pad down the way he had set it down the first time, not quite at arm's length, but with the careful deliberation of someone managing their reaction. 18 days, he said. 18 days, I said. The residual is there, he said. Yes, I said. You have to look for it. But to a casual examiner. To a casual examiner, I said, the fractures would not be visible. He sat down. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, the Verlin literature puts full bone bridging at mature fracture sites, comparable injury mechanism, comparable body mass at a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks. Conservative estimate. Yes, I said. This is 18 days. Yes. He sat with that. It's not an anomaly, he said, eventually. It's not a statistical outlier. It's not a calibration artifact or a documentation error. No, I said. It's just what it does. It appears so, I said. Day 14, the final monitoring scan. I had by this point been in daily contact with senior researcher Voreth Esson at the Kethara Institute's Xenobiology Division Oversight Committee, filing preliminary findings under the anomaly notice Dross had submitted. Voreth Esson is an experienced administrator with 30 cycles in xenobiological research oversight, and I have worked under her review structure for 11 of those cycles. She is not someone who responds emotionally to research findings. She responds analytically, with precision question and a clear sense of what a finding means for the institution's reporting obligations. When I transmitted the Datewell findings to her, she did not respond immediately. This was unusual. Voreth Esson typically responds within 2 hours. She responded the following morning, 8 hours after I had sent the transmission, and her response was 3 lines. The first line asked me to confirm the isotope decay sequencing had been run independently. I confirmed it. The second line asked whether there was any possibility of sample contamination affecting the imaging readouts. I explained in detail why there was not. The third line asked me to complete the monitoring period and submit a full compiled report with every scan in chronological order before discussing the findings further. She did not say anything else. She did not offer an interpretation. She did not say that this was remarkable or alarming or that I should be concerned. She just said, complete the monitoring period and send everything. That told me more than any comment she could have made. The day 14 scan was the final piece. By day 25 post-incident, The subject's left clavicular fracture was resolved beyond the threshold of detection in standard imaging. I found the residual asymmetry only with the same high-resolution search I'd used on the ribs, and it was smaller than what the ribs had shown at day 18. The posterior flank wound was mature scar tissue, thin and complete, the underlying collagen architecture consolidated. There was no sign of ongoing active repair at that site. It was done. The thoracic cage showed a bone mineral density profile that was, and this is the detail that Dross flagged, and that I included verbatim in the report, and that Voreth Esson, when she finally called to discuss the compiled findings, did not speak for 43 seconds after I read it to her higher at the fracture sites than in the surrounding native bone. Not equal to, higher than. The remodeled bone was denser than the original. I have spent considerable time thinking about how to present this finding without overstating it. I do not wish to overstate it. The difference was not dramatic in absolute terms. The percentage increase in mineral density at the remodeled sites compared to the surrounding native tissue was in the range of 7 to 12%. This is not, in isolation, an extraordinary figure. What makes it extraordinary is what it means. The organism's repair process had not simply restored the damaged structure to its prior condition. It had deposited mineral content at a rate and in a distribution that resulted in a stronger structure than the one that had been fractured. In every bone repair model I am familiar with, the remodeled site is the weak point. The site of previous fracture is, in healed bone across essentially all the documented species in our xenobiological literature, a point of relative vulnerability, thinner, less uniform, more susceptible to refracture. This is simply how repair works. You cannot perfectly reconstruct a crystalline structure by rebuilding it from scratch. The original is always better than the repair. The human body had fractured 4 ribs and, in 18 days, produced new bone at those sites that was stronger than what had been there before. I included this finding in the report. I annotated it carefully. I cited the measurement methodology, the comparison baseline, the confidence interval. I made sure there was nothing in my annotation that constituted an interpretation beyond what the data showed. Then I saved the report and sat in my workroom for a long time before I transmitted it. The final examination took place on the morning of the 16th day of the 9th rotation, day 25 post-incident. The subject arrived on time, as he had arrived for every appointment, on time without complaint, with the air of a man who has a schedule and keeps it because that is simply the kind of person he is. He sat in the examination chair. I ran the scans. I reviewed them in his presence without letting my expression communicate what they showed, which required more discipline than I usually need for this. Then I sat down across from him. "Mr. Mail," I said, "I am prepared to sign your clearance documentation." He sat forward slightly, the first movement of genuine relief I had seen from him across the entire monitoring period. "Good," he said. "My cargo run is about 3 weeks behind at this point." "I understand," I said. He started to stand. "I want to ask you one more thing," I said, "if you don't mind." He settled back down. "Sure," he said. "In your experience, your personal experience over your life, how do you typically recover from injury?" He looked at me with that flat, thoughtful expression. He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, but thinking, giving the question the same pragmatic consideration he gave to questions about his dietary intake and his pain management decisions. "Fine," he said, "usually pretty quick." Then, with the half-shrug that was becoming familiar, "I broke my arm when I was 11, playing around on a cargo lift we weren't supposed to be near. My father was furious." A brief, private expression, the memory of that fury, present for just a moment before he set it aside. "They said it put me in a cast for 3 weeks. When they took the cast off, the doctor said it looked like a 6-week heel, said I must have kept it immobilized." He paused. "I hadn't. I was 11. I was terrible at keeping it immobilized. I made a note. Any other significant injuries? I said. He thought, took a bad fall during a hull survey, cracked 2 ribs my left side, same side as now. The station medic said 4 to 6 weeks before I could go back to full duty. I was back in 3. He paused then. She also said I must have been lucky and they were hairline cracks. The imaging had said otherwise, but I figured she knew her job better than I knew my imaging results. Another pause. I guess she didn't. I guess not, I said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at me with that expression, the one I couldn't fully read, that was close to curiosity but had something else in it, some recognition or acceptance. Is this going to be in your report? He said. Yes, I said. He nodded. He did not seem alarmed. He seemed, if anything, mildly interested, the way he would be mildly interested in a piece of information about a ship system he hadn't known about before. Is there anything I should do differently? He said. No, I said. Or avoid? No, I said. What you do appears to work. He made a small sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been the sound of someone accepting an unusual compliment without quite knowing what to do with it. He stood up. He thanked me for my time and told me I ran a good examination facility. I told him I would have the clearance documentation transmitted to the Port Authority by end of day. He thanked me again and left. I sat in the examination room for a long time after he walked out. The room was very quiet. The scans were still on the display behind me. I transmitted the compiled report to Vorath Eson at the Kethara Institute at the 14th hour of the 16th day of the 9th rotation. The report was 142 pages. It included every scan, every blood panel, every measurement annotation, every calibration confirmation, the full chronological sequence from the initial intake transfer note through the final examination. It included the comparison data from the xenobiological literature, Verlin bone repair timelines, Ketharan soft tissue closure rates, Drell collagen synthesis benchmarks, 17 other species references, all annotated. It included the isotope decay confirmation. It included the bone density finding at the remodeled fracture sites, annotated exactly as I described above. At the top of the report in the abstract section, I wrote the following. Subject male presents a pattern of traumatic injury recovery that is inconsistent with all known xenobiological models for species of comparable physiology. The rate of bone bridging, fracture resolution, and soft tissue closure observed across the monitoring period exceeds documented recovery parameters for the closest comparable species by a factor ranging from 2.4 to 3.8, depending on the tissue system examined. This discrepancy cannot be attributed to measurement error, equipment malfunction, documentation error at the originating facility, or individual pathological condition, as the subject's self-reported history suggests a consistent pattern across multiple prior injury events. The findings are consistent with the hypothesis that the documented recovery rate is a species-typical response, not an individual anomaly. I paused for a long time before writing the next sentence, then I wrote it. If this rate is species-typical, the clinical implications for any species that anticipates encountering Terrans in a context of physical conflict, containment, or medical assessment are significant and require formal documentation. I transmitted the report, then I sat back and waited. Vorath Eson called me 6 hours later. It was, by that point, the 22nd hour of the day, which is not when Vorath Eson typically calls. She called anyway. She did not begin with a greeting. She said, "I've read the abstract." "Yes," I said. "And the findings on the fracture sites?" "Yes." "The density increase at the remodeled locations?" "Yes." She was quiet. Not the 43-second quiet of when I'd read her the density finding over transmission. This was a shorter quiet, but heavier. the quiet of someone who has read a thing twice and is deciding what to say about it. "How confident are you in the species-typical hypothesis?" she said. "The subject's self-reported history is consistent with it," I said. "2 prior injuries, both with recovery timelines that were noted as anomalous by the treating physicians, both attributed to alternative explanations, immobilization compliance, hairline rather than full fractures, that the subject now believes were incorrect. The pattern holds." "You didn't run comparative data across a broader Terran sample." "I don't have access to a broader Terran sample," I said. "I have one subject and his own account. I have been appropriately conservative in the report. The species-typical hypothesis is offered as a hypothesis. A well-supported one." "A well-supported one," I agreed. She was quiet again. "The density increase," she said. "Yes," I said. "The remodeled sites are stronger than the originals." "By 7 to 12%, yes." "Which means," she said carefully, "that a Terran who has sustained and recovered from fractures to a given structure has, at those sites, a stronger structure than they had before." "That is what the data shows," I said. A long pause. "V. Thun," she said, which she does not typically do, use my first name, which told me something about what this call was. "Are there combat records that include Terrans sustaining significant skeletal trauma during engagements?" I understood what she was asking. "Yes," I said. "There are a significant number of documented engagements involving Terran forces where significant trauma was sustained. And the Terrans in those engagements," she said slowly, "had in many cases sustained prior injuries." "Yes," I said. "Prior injuries which, on the basis of your findings, we should expect to have been repaired," I said, "and at the sites of repair to be structurally stronger than the originals." She did not say anything for a very long time. I sat with the silence. Eventually she said, "I am going to request a classification upgrade for this report." "I expected that," I said. "And an expansion of the study, if we can obtain consent from additional Terran subjects in a controlled setting." "I will cooperate with however you choose to proceed," I said. "Good." A pause. "Vthun, does the subject male, does he know what the report contains?" "He knows the recovery rate is faster than I expected," I said. "He does not know the specifics of what that implies. He did not ask." "He didn't ask," she said. "No, he asked if it was a problem. I told him it wasn't a problem for him. He seemed satisfied with that." Another pause. "He seems," Voreth Essen began and then stopped. "Unbothered," I said. "Yes," she said, "unbothered." She paused. "Does that not seem strange to you, given what the data shows?" I thought about this carefully. I had been thinking about it in various forms across the entirety of the monitoring period, and I had arrived at an answer that I was not entirely comfortable with. "I think," I said, "that from his perspective none of this is unusual. He has been recovering from injuries at this rate his entire life. The physicians who treated him in the past told him their results, the 6-week heal at 3 weeks, the full fractures written off as hairlines, and he accepted their explanations because he had no reason to question professionals. He did not know there was anything unusual to know. He just healed and then got back to work." Voreth Essen was quiet. "And now he knows," she said. "Now he knows," I said, "that he heals faster than I expected. He doesn't know what that means against the comparative literature. He doesn't know what the density finding says. He thanked me for running a good examination facility and left to file his delayed cargo paperwork." A beat. "He thanked you," Voreth Essen said. "Yes," I said. She did not respond to that. She told me to expect the classification request to go through within 2 days, and that she would be in contact about the expanded study proposal. She told me to take no further contact with the subject until the classification was confirmed and the expanded study protocol had been approved. I told her I had no further examination appointments scheduled and that the subject had already been notified his clearance was complete. She said good. She ended the call. I sat in my workroom for a while longer. The data was still on my screens. 142 pages of findings, and the quiet center of all of it, a man thanking me for the examination, asking whether he should avoid anything, being told no, and walking out. I want to record, in this final section, what I believe the data actually means. Not in clinical language. I've used clinical language for 142 pages, and Voreth Eson will have other researchers reviewing it in clinical language for however long the expanded study runs. I want to record what I think when I sit with it plainly. The human body, the Terran organism, heals at a rate that, if we had observed it in any other context before this, we would have identified as a significant biological advantage. We did not observe it, or we did not note it in the right context, or we noted it and attributed it to something else, which is what the medics who treated Corvin Male did. They attributed it to something else. They were trained observers, professionals, and they were wrong not because they were incompetent, but because the simplest explanation for what they saw, luck, compliance, underestimation of severity, was so much simpler than the alternative that the alternative didn't register. I am now the person for whom the alternative has registered. 7 to 12% denser at the remodeled sites. That figure has been in my mind since I annotated it in the report, and what it means, what it actually, practically means, is that a Terran who has been through a significant injury event and recovered from it is not in a weakened state relative to their prior condition. They are not diminished. They are not carrying the residual vulnerability that every other species I have documented carries after significant skeletal trauma. They are, in the specific and measurable sense of the term, harder to break the second time. I have spent time reviewing our own species literature on Terran physiology going back several decades, the xenobiological assessments, the transit medical records, the general intake physicals that accumulate in the shared database year after year. The literature has not been ignorant of Terrans. We have records on their cardiovascular capacity, their neurological architecture, their immune function at a general level, their reproductive biology, their psychological response to isolation and sustained environmental stress. There is a reasonable body of literature. The Cathara Institute contributed to several of the studies. What I cannot find in any of this literature is a systematic assessment of their injury repair rate. Not a single paper, not a single review. There are incidental mentions in case reports, the occasional notation, as in the cases I described from the subject's own history, that recovery appeared faster than anticipated, attributed in each case to some alternative explanation. There is no paper that looked at these mentions and said, wait, what if it is not the measurement that is wrong? What if the rate is real? Nobody looked. That is the plain fact. We have been studying Terrans long enough to produce a reasonable medical literature on their physiology, and nobody thought to measure this systematically. It did not occur to anyone to look, because nobody expected there to be anything remarkable to see. And because nobody looked, what the subject's childhood physician told his parents after taking off a cast, this healed unusually fast. He must have kept it still, became a small notation, stored nowhere, meaning nothing. We have been accumulating notations like that for decades. I have thought about Voreth Eson's question, about the combat records, the engagements involving Terran forces, the history of documented conflict where Terrans sustained significant trauma and continued to operate. I have thought about it with the specific knowledge I now have, and what it implies, and I will not write out that implication in full here because this account is already going to be classified, and I do not wish to be the person who states it plainly in a document that will outlast my active tenure. I will say only this. If you are the kind of species that expected, when encountering a damaged Terran, to encounter something weakened and therefore manageable. You had the situation backwards. The damaged Terran is not easier to deal with than the undamaged one. It is the other direction. And every engagement that taught a Terran something about how their body handles damage was, on the basis of my findings, an engagement that left them fractionally more capable of handling the next one. Not metaphorically, structurally, in the bone. I reviewed the triage report from Relsasa IV one final time before I closed the case file. I read Asan Dale's note again. Monitoring initiated. Anticipate mortality within 6 to 18 hours. He was a good physician. His clinical judgment, given the species he was most familiar with, was reasonable. He looked at what he was looking at and made the most rational prediction available to him. He was simply predicting the wrong organism. I have reviewed a significant number of xenobiological intake records in my career. I have processed anomaly designations before. I have submitted reports that were classified. I have contributed, in small ways, to the body of knowledge that our species maintains about the others we share the transit systems with, the others we encounter in cargo holds and negotiating chambers and medical bays, the others whose biologies we understand, more or less, well enough to anticipate. I thought I understood well enough. Not completely, you never understand completely, but well enough. I do not think that anymore. The case file on Corvin Mail is sealed. His clearance documentation was transmitted on the day I promised it would be. He is, as of last check, back on the Sasuvan passage, which has been cleared for transit following the hull repairs. He is somewhere in the Kethsora transit corridor doing his job, which involves moving cargo between stations on schedules that he keeps with the same unhurried precision he brought to every appointment with me. Somewhere in his thoracic cage, at 4 sites, there is new bone that is 7 to 12% denser than the bone that surrounded it before it broke. He is probably not thinking about that. I am. I filed a final log entry on the case at the 23rd hour of the 16th day. It was a short entry. The case file required a closing summary from the examining physician, a single line, by convention, characterizing the clinical disposition of the subject at discharge. I sat in front of the entry field for a long time. The convention is something like, subject discharged, clinical clearance issued, no ongoing care required. That is the standard form. I have written that form or some variation of it several hundred times. I wrote something different. I wrote subject discharged, injuries resolved ahead of all applicable biological timelines with structural enhancement at fracture sites, clinical clearance issued, no ongoing care required by the subject. I paused there. Then I added one more line, not part of the formal closing, not clinical language. Just the thing I needed to put somewhere before I closed the file. I wrote, I opened this case expecting to document a death. I am closing it having documented something I do not yet have an adequate framework for. I will keep looking for one. I closed the file. I turned off the display. I sat in the workroom in the dark for a while. Then I went home.